Hey everybody, welcome back to my series discussing our experiences building a Kickstarter-funded game over the last 4 years. In the last video, I talked about everything that led us to create Grave and the events that made us consider it seriously as a project we wanted to pursue. So definitely check out that video if you haven't watched it already. Where I left off, we had just been accepted into the Mix, an independent game event being hosted at the IGN offices during GDC, the Game Developers Conference. This gave us an unprecedented opportunity to reach an audience, and that brought with it a lot of decisions about how to proceed. It was now 2014, and the first conclusion I came to was that I needed to start researching Kickstarter and see what I could do about getting a small amount of funding for the project. I met with a few industry friends and it was suggested that I should increase our original goal of $17K to $30K because it was unlikely that I would be able to do much with the smaller amount. The people I talked to also seemed to think that the game had potential and actually had a shot of making a larger amount of money than we had originally planned in our conservative estimate. The second conclusion, which was a serious risk, was I decided to leave my full-time design job and spend the next month getting ready for the Mix. This was a serious gamble because it meant that I was going to have no income until after the Kickstarter. And that also meant that I was going to be relying on Abby entirely for support, which wasn't sustainable for a very long time. It meant that if things went south and I didn't get the Kickstarter, I would be in a very bad position. But I just didn't see a way that I could take an experimental prototype and get it ready in time for the Mix without focusing on it 100%. As it stood, it was going to be pretty difficult to get everything done in a month anyway, so I felt like it was the only chance I had. I spoke to my boss, Dave Robinson, expecting him to be upset, but instead, he didn't even sound surprised. I don't remember exactly what he said. It was something like, "I've been a designer too, I know you have to go do your thing, don't be a stranger." The fact that I left on good terms was a really important part of how things would come together later, because I was able to do what I needed to do without burning bridges. The next month was pretty insane and furious. I had been researching Kickstarter prior to this, but I proceeded with most of the preparation and planning in earnest following the Mix confirmation. I watched tons of videos about Kickstarter and browsed countless projects, backing quite a few of them to get a feel for what the process was like. I figured out what would likely be good reward tiers, how to structure the content, and how to plan for the content updates. We made a Kickstarter video with the help of a friend who had a really high quality camera, and generally it seemed like we were on track. I'll get into this a bit more, but I was completely unprepared for how much work the Kickstarter was going to be. I did what I thought was enough planning, and I thought that I was doing the right amount of research to preempt problems. I knew that I needed to update content, but I didn't know exactly how much time it was going to take to produce. I also didn't know how much time it would actually take to prep update content or even reach out to people to see if they were interested in checking out the game. I genuinely thought it would take a few hours a week to manage all of those things, and I could continue working on the game full time during that month of the Kickstarter. If we had a team where I was able to task someone with just managing the Kickstarter full time, that's something that we probably could have done. Unfortunately, I totally underestimated the time commitment that the Kickstarter would take in order to be successful, and that would make things a lot more difficult for me in the future. As for the development itself, my friend Dan offered help in his off hours to get a few features resolved, and his input was invaluable. He made sure we had a functioning VR implementation for demoing at the Mix, and solved a variety of issues we had with more technical features. The rest of the development, however, had to be done by me. This presented a really difficult challenge. My professional career up to that point had been as a straight designer, meaning I dug into the engine but didn't work on code or actually implementing features. My college degree was in game art and animation, so I had a good background in some of those technical art skills, but when it came to programming, I had basically never done anything of any significance outside of a few tutorials here and there. Now, I could have asked other people to work pro bono or for credit just to reduce the overall workload, and in some small cases I did. But overall, in general, this honestly just doesn't really sit right with me. I didn't yet know what would happen with the game, and I didn't want to make people invest a huge amount of time in something that may not actually be worthwhile to them. I didn't know how many people we would be able to hire, and I didn't want to make promises. I knew that this was something I wanted to do, and I was going to be making a lot of the decisions about
about it. So I felt like it would be more fair if the bulk of the workload was something that I was taking on myself. Besides, if I wasn't able to do this stuff, it didn't really speak well of our future plans.
There were a few solutions for the code problem that seemed reasonable. One, I decided to invest in a camera system for Unity called Ultimate FPS Camera, or UFPS. UFPS is now owned by Opsiv, but at the time it was developed by Kalle Lundgren and his team at VisionPunk, who provided an incredible amount of support and personal input to help out with a variety of topics, including VR. For level scripting, I used a tool called UScript, though we eventually upgraded to Playmaker due to it having more support and updates. For AI on the initial version of the Kickstarter backer demo, I used a behavior tree system called Rain, which was free and offered a number of options that improved the ability to create AI. Although we have since moved to Behavior Designer by Opsiv, Rain gave us the ability to construct fairly complex behavior that was pretty extensible at the time.
I want to make note that I was not paid to drop these names, but I felt like leaving their names out would be unfair considering the amount of value that they actually provided to us as a company. I'm still amazed by the amount of support and value that Unity asset creators provide, considering that they barely even make enough money in a lot of cases to be sustainable. Trust me, you could pay a lot more to ask somebody to program a lot of the features that you can get out of the box with the Unity Asset Store. Now, this isn't a plug for the Unity Asset Store either. A lot of tools now have features like this, but one of the biggest perks for working in Unity is how much progress you can make thanks to the assets that other developers make. We still use a lot of third-party tools in our games, and I don't think that we'd be where we are now without those features being available.
The other thing, and perhaps the longest shot that had the best positive outcome, was that I decided to teach myself to code. I had tried a few tutorials in C# and ActionScript 3, as well as attempting to make a few feature additions or changes to projects in Unreal Script using Unreal 3, or the UDK, but I'd never been particularly successful at doing so. It's part of why I went to school for art instead of a more traditional computer science degree. I didn't genuinely think it would be possible for my brain to learn to code.
I want to take a little time out here to mention that I've talked to a lot of people who don't think that they personally could ever learn to code. I think this is a real problem for a lot of people because we get taught that certain people have natural gifts or affinity for subjects, and we sort of lionize skills that we don't personally have. The reason this isn't productive is that you can easily trick yourself into believing something is impossible when you simply haven't applied enough effort towards learning how to do it. We tend not to see the hours of practice that seemingly gifted people took to get to the level of skill that they have. Now, some people find it easier to practice than others, and I think that tends to correlate pretty strongly with passion more than it does with any kind of innate ability. It tends to mean that by the time that somebody's become really good at something, a lot of times they haven't even noticed how much time they've spent deliberately practicing because it's been something that's been sort of easy and fun for them. We get in our own way a lot more than we actually struggle with our capacities to learn. Think about anything that you're not able to do and ask yourself, have I legitimately tried to learn this and put hours of dedicated practice towards polishing up my weak spots or focusing on areas that I'm not as strong? Chances are the answer will be no, a lot more than it is yes.
Anyway, in getting ready for Grave, I decided I was going to work on a few ideas. I knew the game needed a day-night cycle, and our system already had that from the work Dan and Alex, the two programmers on the original project, had implemented. So I just needed to make it work with our new systems, such as allowing the time to fast forward after death or trigger enemy behavior. I decided that we would demonstrate what the procedural generation system would feel like without actually having to code the whole system, which actually led to some pretty neat scripted moments that we decided to use for the final game itself. I knew that AI behavior could largely be handled with Rain, so there were just a few things that I needed, including scripting triggers and item interactions. I could also extend code classes from UFPS to try to modify the way the character worked without having to write a whole system from scratch. So on that front, most of the implementation would be understanding and working with a fairly robust and well-documented system. UFPS also gave us a lot of useful features like damage dealing systems, ladders, movement states, and interaction switches, and all of these helped a lot to get things spinning faster. The first system I fully coded myself was a generator that interacted with light objects and required fuel to run. In the future, I would use this lesson in a few of my classes teaching code because it gave me a really great foundational understanding of how to interact between objects, how to toggle states in code, and how to track things over time.
In the end, I custom rolled a number of systems, but the game was still pretty rickety when it came to public demonstration. I hadn't been able to fully finish everything, so I cut the less needed elements and planned to release them as a backer demo later on during the Kickstarter. I wasn't totally confident our build would be stable, but I did the best I could, and I have to thank Dan in particular for the work that he did to tackle some of the harder stuff.
We traveled to GDC by car and planned to stay with a friend to save money. I was running extremely low on funds, and when we arrived in San Francisco, I was shocked to find that I had accidentally booked the hotel for a month prior due to a confusion with the online system. I was so low on money that I had to ask my friend to cover the cost of the room that I thought was already covered. The mix was on the first night following our arrival. Our hotel was also blocks away from the event. We didn't have money for a taxi or rideshare, so we had to carry all the equipment the whole way and then arrive hopefully not looking like we had suffered from exhaustion.
I try to attend GDC every year, and I usually use my comfort level at walking through the streets of San Francisco as a kind of benchmark to determine my overall healthiness. I was especially overweight at the time, and lugging this PC hardware was honestly pretty strenuous. I try to avoid being that unhealthy, but I wasn't actually taking my health and well-being as primary concerns when I was getting ready for the mix and the Kickstarter. By the way, I'm not advocating that that's what you do, I'm just explaining that that's what I did in this case, so don't take that as actual advice. I would take it back if I could.
We arrived at the mix and it was really intimidating. There were tons of developers setting up, and many of them were people whose games I had actually heard of before completely outside of the mix.
I had been working in games for about 2 years collectively, but this was a huge escalation of the stakes. I had worked in test at THQ, I had been the designer on a number of projects, particularly at Redacted, and I'd also worked on a variety of small contract jobs. I felt I had proven myself in my area of expertise, but suddenly I was meeting people who were internationally famous. Some of them were even the people that I had been researching when I was trying to figure out what we would do with our Kickstarter. Needless to say, it felt like a lot of pressure.
I got to meet Justin Woodward, the host of the event, who was extremely friendly and welcoming. He had worked at IGN before starting the mix, and talking to him put my mind a bit at ease. I was still worried as hell, but knowing that we were being received warmly made things a whole lot easier.
Justin's one of my favorite people and has been really supportive through the years. He's a developer himself, but he also really cares about the people who work with him through the mix or who show at his events. I suggest you check him out as well as the game that he's working on, Jay and Silent Bob's Chronic Blunt Punch.
When the event got started, the first person who came over to us was a VR reporter named Kevin Joyce, who was excited to see that we were running Grave in VR mode. He had founded the company VR Focus, and right from the get-go, I knew that this was going to be a make-or-break moment. There was only one problem. Grave wasn't working.
Right before leaving for GDC, I had wrapped up what I was working on and decided to move the player to a different starting location so we didn't have to include as much content as I had originally planned. What I hadn't realized was that the ladders actually had a bug in VR, and while they worked fine during normal play, if you were using a VR headset, you could actually only climb the ladders from certain angles. In this case, that made all of the ladders at the very start of the game, right where the player spawns, completely useless.
I really had no choice, so I tried to diagnose what was wrong and make another build that corrected the problem. So I loaded up the Unity editor and got to work trying to figure out what the problem was. Fortunately, Kevin was conversational and was willing to chat with us while I was sweating bullets making a new build of our game at the event while press was waiting to play it. This honestly felt like a worst case scenario, and I was genuinely thinking I had ruined the entire trip. Kevin waited way longer than he needed to, and I eventually wrapped up a build that worked. We put him in the game, and he was actually intrigued. The game featured a few interesting, surreal elements, like a crazy rotating statue Dan had made, creatures attacked with shrill shrieks, and in general, it was a fairly interesting, if not fully polished, experience.
This whole incident honestly makes me feel pretty sick just even recalling it. I've made a lot of mistakes and overlooked things in the past, but this particular event was really frightening. I still have nightmares today about going to an event and finding out the build we spent all night working on was just not going to work. I know this is a fear a lot of developers have, but it was definitely something that left an impression on me.
The rest of the event was a lot more relaxed, and we got a chance to talk to a ton of press as well as other developers. We had people from Game Informer, Destructoid, GameSpot, and Polygon check out our game, and we told a number of them that we were starting up a Kickstarter shortly following the event. One of the best things that happened is we had a representative from Microsoft, Dave Mianowski, play our game, and he was really interested in the game because overall it seemed polished and marketable. He wanted to schedule a follow-up meeting during the conference to discuss putting Grave on the Xbox One. This result was honestly way beyond what we had expected, and I knew that this was going to increase our chances of Kickstarter success if we could be approved on the platform before the Kickstarter ended.
I want to take a detour for a second and explain why this is significant. The market has shifted a lot in the last 4 years, but at this time in particular, getting approved for a console was extremely rare and carried with it a certain amount of prestige. Most established developers have access to platform holders and can essentially somewhat choose who they want to develop for. If you're an indie with limited prior experience or low name recognition, this really isn't the case. We've gotten into discussions since with consumers about why we picked Xbox One instead of PlayStation 4 during our Kickstarter, and the answer is we didn't. I don't mean to disparage Microsoft in any way, but we were actually just looking for what we could get. If we had happened to meet a Sony representative at the mix and that person had really liked our game, things could have gone the completely opposite direction. As it stood, this meeting was actually one of the most significant things that happened to us the entire time we were at the mix.
Overall, the mix was a huge success and honestly exceeded our expectations. Not only did we have a huge number of press people play and meet a number of really great developers, some of whom would end up becoming good friends, we also got a contact list of mix attendees that allowed us to easily follow up with the people we met there. A few days after the mix, while we were still at GDC, Dan messaged me and told me that he had seen a preview of Grave on DSO Gaming, one of his preferred sources of game news. I think it hit him at that point that what we were doing might have had a shot of being successful. I don't think he was pessimistic per se before, but he did have sort of measured expectations of what the outcome would be. Seeing it in an unrelated place on the internet, I think, made it feel real for him, and he was uncharacteristically complimentary about the work I had done to get things to where they were. It's a call I still remember because it cemented for me the belief that what we were doing might just be worth it.
Again, I can't emphasize enough how important the mix actually was to us. I didn't know at the time if I should bank as much on the success of this event as I did, but in retrospect, I don't think there was any way that our Kickstarter could have been a success without having taken this step. Not only did the mix give us great contacts, but it legitimized what we were doing in a way that I hadn't expected. It immediately indicated that we were worth looking at, and that would end up snowballing as we went through the process of the next month.
So right after the mix, I had a few things to attend to. We were in San Francisco a whole week for the conference, but there was still work to be done if I was going to launch the Kickstarter right after GDC and maximize exposure. One of the first things I did was make a trailer while sitting in my hotel room or coffee shop. So I captured footage on my main PC of me simply playing the game and put together some mildly evocative text to suggest what the game was about. This was the first time I had ever made a trailer of any kind, and although I would go on to make more trailers for the company and massively improve my abilities on that front, this was very much a trial by fire. I didn't even make a proper HD version of the trailer and had to re-export it after figuring out how to do that in my video editing software. So the trailer was better than nothing, and collectively between the original and HD versions of the trailer, we got over 100,000 views on our channel, and it was shared and mirrored by numerous outlets. I also learned to take user feedback seriously in the comment sections. People who responded to the trailer provided their genuine, if sometimes cynical, reactions to what they saw.
I knew that a lot of what was being said was kind of harsh or unfair, and I could have taken it that way entirely. A lot of me wanted to say, hey guys, like, come on, we're just a small indie studio and this is really preliminary work. I could have been extremely defensive, and I've definitely seen a lot of developers respond to these kind of things with excuses.
I'm sure I still did that a couple of times, but in general, what I tried to observe was that other games in the same genre had better reactions to their trailers, oftentimes overwhelming enthusiasm and exclamations of excitement. A good example of this was the reveal trailer for The Forest, an indie survival game that was announced shortly before we did our Kickstarter. Most of the reactions were things like, "OMG, I want this," or "This game looks sick." For those games, we didn't see a lot of people complaining about things they didn't like in the trailer.
What I was noticing was simply that an average user's entire understanding of the product was derived from that trailer. This means that everything that was there and everything that wasn't there created the perception of what the product was. And it wasn't enough to just throw stuff together, because people would watch the entire 2 minutes of a trailer and come away with a clearly defined vision of what they thought that product was, based on rapidly moving images that were selected, in some cases maybe randomly or unintentionally by me.
For example, my choice to show a placeholder effect where a creature flashes white bursts when hit with the flashlight led many people to accuse us of making an Alan Wake clone, something I hadn't at all anticipated. This was because I only had one instance of actual combat illustrated in the trailer, and it happened to look and sound similar to another game. Grave wasn't even inspired by Alan Wake. Although I had, of course, played and enjoyed Alan Wake, to me from a design perspective, the flashlight wasn't actually a weapon in that game, as much as it was a means to make enemies vulnerable before executing them with conventional firearms. In fact, the origins of Grave's monsters were much more connected to things like the movie They by Wes Craven, Pitch Black with Vin Diesel, or even The Descent. It was steeped in a much more classic tradition of monsters being afraid of or repelled by light, and I honestly didn't anticipate that people would reference Alan Wake at all, because it wasn't even in my list of top 10 influences when I set out to define the tone or intent of the game.
The problem with this explanation was that in my subconscious brain, I had picked a particle and sound effect combo that, when taken as the only demonstration of the game's combat, clearly alluded to things that were in the audience's head. In future trailers, we didn't get these types of comparisons, because I had become a lot more careful of how I selected imagery.
If you read the book Console Wars by Blake Harris, there's a section of the book where a marketing company attempting to pitch their advertising to Sega of America is experimenting with how to express ideas about games to their mostly teen audience. At the time, a lot of the conventions of advertising for games hadn't been established, but they identified that all the consumers they showed ads to were very astute about observing even tiny details in rapidly moving images. Some people would scoff that the ad mentioned Sonic 2, but showed less than 3 seconds of footage that was actually from Sonic 1 instead. This was a big part of how they arrived at the fast, frenetic marketing campaign that Sega of America became known for. I didn't know this at the time, but I was basically reverse engineering this concept as a new developer looking at feedback to our marketing materials. I didn't have the experience or training to know how to address these types of issues at the outset, but one of the reasons I think our company has been able to improve over time is I always try to be aggressively self-critical.
There's actually more of a problem when you stop getting feedback. When people respond to your game uncritically, you don't really have anything to take away from that. And the worst thing that can possibly happen is that they don't respond at all. The last thing you want is people to not be interested enough to tell you you suck. If you have negative feedback, you can work with it and improve.
Another challenge I was facing was that I was actually totally broke. An automatic payment had been processed without my knowledge, and I had my card declined for a coffee the day after the mix. I went from being on a tremendous high to being extremely low. I genuinely wasn't sure if I would be able to come back home from San Francisco without taking dire steps.
I had to call friends and beg them to let me borrow $500 so that I could survive the week in San Francisco and pay for gas and expenses. All I could really do is promise that I would pay them back ASAP. This situation honestly felt like I had jumped out of a plane without a parachute and was hoping that I could just catch a bird to cushion my fall. I had quit a job where I was making $50K a year to gamble on a Kickstarter that to this point hadn't even been launched. I was fully aware that this was something where we could fail, but something about my personality has always made me more uncomfortable with not doing things than doing them.
Fortunately, one of my final checks from Redacted had been delayed, but actually came through shortly before the end of GDC. I had honestly forgotten that our checks had been offset by a month, and that I would be receiving my actual final check a month after I had left the company.
Things like this were extremely fortunate, and I honestly don't know what I would have done for the subsequent month if I hadn't had that last check. I hadn't actually planned this properly, but in that case, I was lucky enough to receive some pennies from heaven that would actually save me in a clinch.
As GDC wrapped up for the year, I went to the hotel and stayed up all night before we were supposed to leave, getting the last touches of the Kickstarter ready and preparing to hit the button to go live. I decided to set the Kickstarter for 35 days instead of the usual 30. I had read a lot that Kickstarters at 30 days actually make a larger overall return than ones that are longer, particularly when you look at ones that are up to 60 days. This is in part due to the greater sense of urgency that encourages people to pledge when they see it, rather than assume they can wait and check back later. I picked 35 days, honestly, because I figured that I would stumble a bit during the early launch period and wanted to have the chance to build up some steam. I finally pushed the button at 3 a.m. and found out, almost hilariously considering how much sleep I'd cost myself, that the Kickstarter actually couldn't go live until it was approved, and this could take a few days. Because of this, our Kickstarter was delayed by about a week, but this was actually for the best.
I didn't know at the time, but most press people are a bit comatose after events like GDC. You're not going to get much in the way of press coverage directly following those events, whether it's GDC, E3, PAX, or any other major event that a lot of press attends. You always want to be mindful of your audience, and when you're dealing with promotion, a lot of your audience is actually going to be the press itself.
So in this extra time before the launch, I planned a bit more about what I was going to do for the Kickstarter updates and outreach, started the ball rolling talking to Microsoft about the Xbox One version, and set up the Steam Greenlight page that I was going to run in tandem with our Kickstarter to make sure we had a minimum of at least one distribution channel. I didn't reach out to anyone in advance, which was a mistake I didn't know I was making, but I was happy to have the extra time to organize things. I just didn't fully know what I was getting myself into.
Again, I cannot stress enough how little in the way of marketing experience I had when I set out to do this Kickstarter. From the time the Kickstarter began, I was basically going to have to teach myself how to market a product for the first time. That would produce a lot of missteps, but also a lot of opportunities for growth. So that's all for this part. Please check in for the next video where I discuss the whole process of actually running and eventually completing our Kickstarter. This video series has taken a while to produce, and if you like what you see here so far, please consider throwing in some support on Patreon. You can also follow me on Twitter, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to receive notifications about new videos as they come out.